It started as one of those mornings that felt deceptively ordinary, the kind of day you never expect will end in tragedy. And as I helped my daughter Emily get ready for school, I remember thinking how much stronger she was than the world ever gave her credit for, how she always smiled, even when her legs refused to carry her without the help of her wheelchair, how she laughed at the smallest joys despite the endless obstacles life placed in her path, and how proud I was to be her mother, watching her comb through her small pile of dolls with shaky but determined hands, whispering to them as if they were her audience, her little stage of make-believe that kept her heart alive. And yet beneath that joy, there was always an undercurrent of fear in me, the fear that something might happen, something I couldn't control, because when you are the parent of a disabled child, you live with that constant awareness that every breath they take feels like both a blessing and a risk. And as the sunlight poured in through our kitchen window that morning while Emily ate her cereal and hummed to herself, I felt that old familiar worry scratching at the back of my mind, though I pushed it aside because she looked happy and strong. And I didn't want to ruin that moment by drowning it in my own anxiety, so we talked about her favorite stories, about how one day she wanted to be a singer, even though her voice was soft and sometimes trembled, and I promised her that if she kept believing in herself, she could stand on a stage and make people listen not just to her voice, but to her soul, and she beamed at me with that wide, pure smile that only children can give, the kind that makes you forget for a second about all the cruelty in the world, the kind that blinds you with hope. But fate has a way of taking hope and twisting it into heartbreak, and just as I was about to roll her toward the door, her small hand clutched at her chest, and her breathing turned sharp like someone had stolen all the air out of the room, and her lips trembled as her eyes widened in panic. And instantly my heart froze, because I knew this wasn't one of those moments where she just needed a little rest. This was something darker, more dangerous, something clawing at her body from the inside. And I scooped her into my arms without even thinking, feeling the way her body trembled against me, so fragile, so breakable, and yet she still tried to be brave for me, whispering, "Mommy, I don't feel good," in that tiny voice that shattered me completely. And the next thing I knew, I was rushing out of the house, fumbling with my keys, nearly tripping over myself as I carried her to the car, the world around me suddenly turning into a blur of noise and movement, neighbors waving casually as if nothing was wrong, as if they couldn't see the storm brewing inside my chest, and by the time I strapped her into her seat, her skin already looked paler, her breaths shorter, and I could feel the clock ticking louder and louder in my head, every second screaming at me that I might lose her if I didn't act fast, and yet traffic seemed endless as I drove, red lights mocking me, horns blaring as I swerved through lanes, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, praying out loud, begging God not to take her from me. Not like this, not so suddenly, and the sound of Emily's shallow breathing filled the car, each inhale weaker than the last, and I reached back at every stop to touch her face, to keep her awake, to tell her I was right here, that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. But deep down, a terror unlike anything I had ever known gnawed at me, the terrifying thought that no matter how much I loved her, no matter how desperately I tried, there were battles even a mother couldn't fight alone, and as the hospital finally came into view, towering and sterile against the horizon, I felt that brief flicker of relief, like maybe we had made it in time, like maybe help was waiting just inside those glass doors, unaware that what awaited us there wasn't salvation but the cruelest rejection, the kind of indifference that cuts deeper than any wound, the kind that leaves you questioning how people sworn to protect life could turn their backs on it. And though I didn't know it yet, that morning that had started with cereal and laughter was about to end with a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open with a hiss, and I rushed inside with Emily cradled in my arms, her head lolling weakly against my shoulder, her breaths so shallow I could barely feel them on my skin. And though my heart hammered with relief at finally reaching the place I believed would save her, the sterile white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights somehow felt more menacing than comforting, as though they were swallowing us into a place where compassion could not reach, and every second of hesitation from the people around me stabbed at my chest like a knife. But I shouted anyway, calling for help, begging anyone who would listen to see that my little girl was dying, and the echo of my voice carried down the hallway, bouncing off in different faces that turned toward me with varying shades of curiosity and annoyance, but not urgency, not the desperate rush I had imagined. And as I staggered toward the reception desk, my arms aching from the weight of holding Emily, but my grip never loosening, I slammed my hand against the counter, demanding a doctor, demanding someone come now. And the woman behind the desk barely looked up, her expression detached as though I were asking for directions instead of screaming for my child's life, and she mumbled something about waiting, about procedures, and my blood boiled because didn't she see the way Emily's lips were turning faintly blue? Didn't she hear the rasp of her breath, like sandpaper, tearing at her throat? Didn't she care? But there was no time to argue, and I screamed again, louder this time, roar, until finally a pair of orderlies came jogging around the corner with a gurney, their eyes widening at the sight of my daughter's limp form, and they rushed us toward the emergency wing while I clung to her hand, whispering over and over that it was going to be okay, that Mommy was right here. But my reassurances felt hollow when her tiny fingers barely squeezed mine back, like the strength was, draining from her minute by minute. And as we turned the corner into a blindingly bright corridor filled with doors and nurses bustling about, I thought surely now, surely here, someone would take her, someone would fight for her. But instead, we were intercepted by a figure who seemed carved out of stone, a nurse with cold eyes and a voice that cut sharper than any blade as she barked at the orderlies to stop, demanding to know if we had been registered, if we had filled out forms, if we had insurance. And in that instant, I realized with a gut-wrenching horror that red tape was standing between my daughter and the chance to live, that this woman, this gatekeeper in scrubs, was more concerned with policies and paperwork than with the fragile child barely breathing in my arms. And I pleaded with her, begged through tears, told her Emily couldn't wait another second, but she crossed her arms and shook her head, her lips curling with disdain, as though my desperation was an inconvenience, as though my daughter's suffering was an exaggeration. And every moment she argued with me, I could feel Emily slipping further away, her chest rising slower, her skin growing colder. And I wanted to scream, to tear through that hallway myself and find someone who cared, but my legs felt like lead, my heart like it was breaking in real time. And as the nurse ordered the orderlies to wheel us back to the waiting area, I thought I was going to collapse because how could this be happening? How could a place meant for healing become a prison of indifference? And in my mind, the clock kept ticking, deafening, cruel, each second a hammer strike, reminding me that Emily didn't have the luxury of waiting, that every breath she struggled for might be her last. And yet, the more I fought, the more resistance I met, until finally I dropped to my knees in the middle of that hallway, clutching Emily to my chest, sobbing so hard I could barely see, begging anyone who passed by to help me to save her. And some looked at us with pity, others with annoyance. But no one stopped, no one lifted a hand, and the cruel reality sank in, that in this place my daughter was just another number, another case to be filed away, when convenient, not a human life hanging in the balance, and as her body grew heavier in my arms, I realized I had entered a race against time that I was already losing, and the finish line was something I couldn't bear to imagine. The nurse who stood before me that day was named Linda, though in my mind she would forever remain a shadow, a cold figure whose name carried the taste of ash, and as she looked down at Emily's limp body in my arms, there was not even a flicker of compassion in her eyes, only the kind of hardened indifference that comes from years of choosing policies over people, rules over mercy. And I will never forget the way she tilted her head slightly, as if assessing a broken toy rather than a fragile child clinging to life, her lips pressed into a thin line as she repeated again that without proper admission and insurance approval, there was nothing she could do. And for a moment, I thought I must be dreaming, because how could a nurse, someone trained to heal, someone who had taken an oath to protect life, deny a dying girl treatment just because of paperwork? But the reality hit me harder than any nightmare ever could, and my knees buckled under the weight of Emily in my arms, my tears spilling onto her pale cheeks as I begged Linda to listen, to see us not as forms or numbers, but as a mother and daughter, as human beings standing on the edge of a precipice. Yet she only sighed impatiently and told me that if I didn't calm down, security would be called, as though my desperation was a threat rather than the raw cry of a mother watching her child slip away. And the cruelty of that moment seared into my memory, the way her voice remained steady and cold, the way she leaned on the counter with her arms crossed as though we were an inconvenience to her shift, the way she turned her gaze past me toward the clock on the wall, like she had better things to do than witness my agony, and I wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to force her to look at Emily and understand, but my voice cracked with exhaustion and fear, my words coming out broken, while Emily let out a soft whimper that barely rose above a whisper, a sound so faint it almost disappeared into the air, yet to me it was louder than any siren, a final plea that I could not answer alone, and I begged once more, my voice hoarse, telling Linda that my daughter had a heart condition, that she had collapsed suddenly, that every second mattered. But instead of rushing into action, she raised an eyebrow and said something that shattered me completely. If she's been sick for so long, maybe it's just her time. Words delivered with such cold finality that I thought I would faint right there, because in that instant I understood that to her Emily's life had no value, that she saw my little girl not as a child worth saving, but as a burden, an inconvenience that didn't fit neatly into her system, and the rage that ignited inside me battled against the despair threatening to consume me, and I wanted to fight her, to push past her, to find anyone else in that building with a shred of humanity, but she stepped closer, her hand hovering over the phone on her desk, reminding me again that if I caused a disturbance, security would remove me, and then no one would help at all. And in that twisted moment, I realized I was trapped, held hostage by a woman in scrubs who held the power to open the doors to help but refused, a gatekeeper of life and death, whose judgment was not guided by compassion but by cruelty, and every second dragged like a lifetime as Emily's breathing grew shallower, her chest barely moving, her lips quivering with effort, and I pressed my forehead against hers, whispering, through sobs that I wouldn't give up, that I would find a way, even as Linda stood above us like a statue carved out of ice, and the buzzing lights above flickered with a harsh hum, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling my nostrils, making me feel like I was suffocating in a place that was supposed to be safe. And as people passed by, some glancing briefly before turning away, I realized with horror that no one would challenge her, that everyone else seemed too afraid or too conditioned to question her authority, and that isolation crushed me, made me feel smaller than I had ever felt before. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance lit up, because I knew if I didn't keep fighting, if I didn't keep pushing, Emily would die right there in my arms, while a nurse who swore to heal watched with folded arms, and that thought was unbearable. So even as my body trembled and my vision blurred with tears, I forced myself to stand, holding Emily tighter, and I looked Linda in the eyes, with all the fury and grief burning inside me, vowing silently that if she continued to refuse us, I would tear down every wall in that place to get my daughter the help she deserved, because no amount of coldness, no amount of policy could stop a mother who was staring into the face of losing her child. I don't know where the strength came from, but as Linda's cold stare bore into me, I clutched Emily tighter to my chest and stumbled past her, ignoring her shouts that I wasn't allowed beyond the desk, my ears deaf to her threats of security, because all I could hear was the slowing, fragile rhythm of my daughter's breaths, and with every step through that maze of sterile corridors, I felt like I was sprinting against death itself, every second a reminder that time was running out, and I shouted for help, my voice echoing off the white walls, raw with desperation, and finally a young intern in scrubs peeked out from a room, his eyes wide when he saw Emily in my arms. But before he could take a step forward, Linda's voice cut through the air like a whip, her tone sharp, commanding him to stay put, reminding him about protocol, and I watched in horror as the boy froze, his compassion shackled by fear of authority, his face twisted with conflict as he lowered his eyes and stepped back into the room, leaving me alone again, and rage boiled in my chest because how could one woman's cruelty outweigh my daughter's life? How could people see her fading and still do nothing? But I couldn't stop, not now. Not when Emily's head rested limply against my shoulder, her small fingers twitching weakly as though begging me not to give up. So I pressed forward, slamming my hand against door after door, pleading with nurses, doctors, anyone who would listen. But time and again I was met with excuses with hollow words about procedures, with sympathetic looks that never turned into action, and each rejection cut deeper, each wasted moment another step closer to the unthinkable, until my knees threatened to buckle beneath me, and I collapsed against the wall, sliding down with Emily in my lap, my tears dripping onto her face as I whispered to her, begged her to hold on just a little longer, that I was going to find someone, anyone, and for a fleeting moment her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused, but still searching for me, and that tiny spark of life reignited my fight because I could not let her die in a hallway, not surrounded by apathy and indifference, not without doing everything in my power to save her. So I pushed myself up again, every muscle screaming, my vision blurred with exhaustion, and I staggered into another wing of the hospital, this one quieter, lined with doors that read, Critical Care and ICU, and my heart leapt because surely here in the place where lives hung by a thread every day, someone would act, someone would see the urgency in my eyes, and I burst into the first room I could find, startling a doctor mid-sentence as he stood with a clipboard, and I begged him, sobbed at his feet, showed him Emily's trembling body, but even he hesitated, glancing nervously toward the hall where Linda's figure now loomed like a shadow, her presence infecting even this place with fear, and he stammered something about needing authorization, about needing to clear it with administration, and my scream tore from my throat, raw and guttural, a sound I barely recognized as my own, because how many times could they hide behind rules while my child's life slipped away in front of them? And for a moment the doctor's hands shook, his eyes darting between me and Linda, and I thought maybe he would finally break free of the chains of procedure. But then he lowered his gaze, defeated, and I felt a hollow emptiness spread through me, a realization that no one here was going to help unless I forced them to, that I was fighting not just against Emily's illness, but against an entire system built to suffocate urgency with red tape, and I turned away from the doctor, my chest heaving with sobs, my arms trembling from the effort of holding Emily, and I stumbled blindly down the hall, the world spinning, my knees buckling, until I fell again to the floor, clutching her limp body, rocking her back and forth, as though my embrace alone could anchor her to this world. And the thought that I might lose her here in this cold and heartless place tore at me like knives, but somewhere in the fog of my despair, I felt a flicker of defiance, a burning need to keep fighting, to keep pushing, because giving up wasn't an option, not when her fragile breath still brushed against my neck, faint but present. A reminder that she was still here, still holding on, waiting for me to save her. And as Linda's footsteps echoed closer, her voice, rising as she demanded I stop causing a scene, I looked down at Emily, at her pale face and trembling lips, and I swore to her and to myself that I would not stop, that even if I had to break every wall in this place, even if I had to scream until my voice was gone, I would find someone, I would force them to see her, because no mother should ever have to watch her child die while a hospital full of people turn their backs. And as I pulled myself up once more, Emily pressed weakly against my chest. The fight inside me hardened into steel, because though the system was stacked against me, though the nurse seemed determined to stand between us and salvation, I knew that nothing, not fear, not rules, not threats, would silence me now. I will never forget the moment when Emily's tiny body grew heavier in my arms, not because she had grown, but because the fragile strength inside her seemed to finally give way. And as I staggered down the corridor, my legs trembling beneath the weight of love and terror, I felt her head slump against my shoulder, her breaths shallow and uneven, each one a battle she was losing, and panic clawed at my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe either, like I was suffocating alongside her, and I dropped to the cold tile floor, clutching her to me, rocking her as if motion alone could keep her tethered to life, my sobs raw and echoing down the sterile hallway. But no one came, no one rushed to our side. And in that silence, the horror of it all pressed down on me, because I realized I was watching the very thing I had feared since the day she was born unfold before my eyes, and I wasn't enough to stop it, no matter how much I begged or fought, no matter how tightly I held her, my love could not fill her lungs, my arms could not restart her faltering heart, and the helplessness shattered me more than anything ever had. Because what kind of mother was I if I couldn't save my child, if I could only sit there and watch the light drain from her eyes? But even as despair tore through me, Something inside me rebelled, some primal part of me that refused to let go, and I pressed my forehead against hers, whispering through choking sobs all the memories I could, desperate to keep her, spirit anchored to this world. Reminding her of the nights we stayed up singing together, of the mornings she begged for pancakes shaped like stars, of the way she laughed at the simplest things, a laugh that sounded like bells. Reminding her of the time she told me she wanted to be a singer, and I promised her I'd be her biggest fan, telling her over and over that she wasn't done yet, that she had so much more life to live, that I needed her because without her my world would crumble into nothing, and for a fleeting second her eyelids fluttered, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but no words came, only a faint exhale that felt like it might be her last. And in that instant, my heart cracked completely. The pain, unlike anything I had ever known, worse than fire, worse than knives, because it was the pain of watching the person you love most in the world slip beyond your reach, and rage flared inside me. Rage at Linda, at the hospital, at every person who had turned away because they had stolen precious minutes, they had stood by and let bureaucracy strangle hope. And now my baby was slipping because of their cruelty, and I wanted to scream, to tear the world apart, to make them feel what I was feeling, but all I could do was hold her tighter, my tears soaking her hair as I begged her to stay, begged her not to leave me, promising her I would fix this somehow, and the memories kept flashing in my mind like cruel reminders of what I was about to lose. The way she called me mommy in that sweet voice, the way her little hands used to grip my fingers like they were her anchor, the way she lit up every room despite all her struggles, and I thought of the nights she cried because other children made fun of her wheelchair, the time she asked me if she was a burden, and I had sworn to her she was the greatest gift I had ever been given, and now, as her chest barely rose and fell, I realized she might never hear me say those words again, and the grief ripped through me so violently that my screams echoed down the hall like an animal in mourning, a sound that should have shattered the indifference of everyone around. But the doors remained closed, the footsteps distant, as though the world had turned its back completely, and I rocked her against me, whispering lullabies through tears, songs I used to sing when she was scared at night, my voice cracking as I begged her to fight, begged her not to leave me alone in this cruel, cold world, and though my arms trembled with exhaustion, though my spirit felt crushed beneath the weight of despair, I swore that this was not the end, that I would drag her back from the edge if I had to rip the hospital apart brick by brick, because no one was going to take my baby from me, not like this, not without a fight that would leave scars on every soul who had let us suffer. And in that moment, with her fragile breath whispering against my neck, I felt the full weight of my love and my rage intertwine, a fire so fierce inside me that it refused to let her go quietly. And though I knew I was losing her, though every second felt like it was slipping through my fingers, I clung to hope with a desperation that bordered on madness, because I would not accept a world where Emily's voice was silenced forever. And as the hallway seemed to blur around us, spinning with the weight of my grief, I felt myself break completely. Yet within that breaking came a vow, sharp and unyielding, that I would not let her life end here, that even if she took her final breath in my arms, the world would know what had been done to her, and those who had refused her would feel the weight of her loss for the rest of their days. The world seemed to collapse into silence as Emily's chest rose one final time, her breath rattling weakly against my ear. And then, in an instant so cruel I can barely put it into words, it stopped, the fragile rhythm that had carried her through every moment of her short life simply ended. And I felt it. I felt the exact second her spirit slipped away, her body growing impossibly still in my arms, her small lips parting as if she were about to whisper to me. But nothing came, and in that frozen moment, my heart shattered into 1,000 unfixable pieces, a pain so vast and unbearable that I thought I might die right there on that cold hospital floor with her. Because how could the world go on turning when my little girl was gone? How could the lights keep buzzing above me? How could footsteps keep echoing in the hallway? How could life itself continue when hers had been stolen in front of my eyes? And I clutched her limp body to my chest, sobbing with a force that tore through me, rocking her back and forth as if I could coax her back, screaming her name over and over, begging her breathe, to come back, to not leave me alone. But her skin was already cooling, her weight already changing, and the horrible truth consumed me. My daughter had died in my arms, not at home surrounded by love, not in a peaceful sleep, but in a hospital full of people who refused to see her, who let her slip away because of rules and indifference, and the grief twisted into rage so hot. It seared me from the inside, and when I lifted my head and saw Linda standing just a few feet away, her arms still crossed, her face unreadable, I felt a fury unlike anything I'd ever known, a fury that made me want to rip the walls down, to make her feel every ounce of the pain she had just inflicted by her refusal, and my voice, hoarse and broken, exploded through the hallway as I screamed at her, demanded to know how she could live with herself, how she could watch a child die without lifting a finger, how she could stand there and do nothing when she had the power to save her, and Linda didn't flinch, didn't move, just pursed her lips and said coldly that she had followed hospital protocol, that I had been hysterical, that she had warned me to calm down, as if somehow my grief and desperation were the problem, not her refusal to treat Emily, and those words sliced through me worse than knives, because they reduced my baby's life to a line in a rule book, a box unchecked. And I felt myself shaking with such violent rage, I thought I might collapse under it. But I held Emily tighter, pressing my cheek against hers, whispering apologies into her lifeless ear, telling her over and over how sorry I was, how much I loved her, how I should have fought harder, run faster, screamed louder, anything, everything to keep her here. And as the world blurred through my tears, I realized something else. The silence that had greeted me in that hallway, the apathy of the staff, the stone-cold cruelty of Linda, none of it would remain hidden because I would make sure the world knew what had happened here. I would make sure Emily's final breath would echo far beyond these walls, that those responsible would never escape the weight of her death. And yet, in that moment, as security guards finally appeared at the far end of the hall, drawn by the sound of my screams, but far too late to make any difference, I knew I wasn't ready to let go, not ready to place her in anyone. Elsa's hands not ready to admit she was gone, and I clutched her to me like a mother animal protecting her cub, snarling through my sobs as they approached, daring them to try to take her from me, daring Linda to look me in the eyes again, because in that moment I wasn't just a grieving mother, I was something far more dangerous. I was a mother with nothing left to lose, and that kind of pain and fury doesn't fade, it doesn't soften, it doesn't forgive, it burns, it scars, it demands justice. And as the guards hovered uncertainly, as doctors finally peeked around corners with faces full of belated concern, as Linda stood, unshaken in her pitiless stance, I rocked Emily in my arms, whispering her name like a prayer, like a weapon, vowing aloud that her death would not be buried under paperwork and lies, vowing that the world would know she had been refused, that she had been neglected, that she had been allowed to die not by fate, but by cruelty. And though my tears blurred everything, though my throat ached from screaming, though my arms trembled from holding her still form, my voice rose clear and sharp with one final promise: she will not be forgotten. You will pay for this. The days that followed Emily's death blurred into a haze of grief, so raw I could barely breathe. Yet beneath that grief burned a relentless fire, refusal to let her final moments be buried under sterile paperwork and dismissive explanations, and while I held her funeral with trembling hands, laying her small body to rest in a white coffin adorned with flowers she had once loved to pick, I swore silently over her grave that her name would not vanish into silence, that Nurse Linda's cold refusal and the hospital's cruel negligence would be dragged into the light for the entire world to see. And as mourners whispered condolences, I felt an unfamiliar steel harden within me, a strength I hadn't known I possessed, the strength of a mother with nothing left to lose. And so, while the dirt was still fresh over Emily's resting place, I began to gather every scrap of evidence I could, filing reports, demanding medical records, cornering administrators who tried to brush me aside with, rehearsed lines about policy and procedure, and every time someone tried to placate me, I would see Emily's face in my mind, her lips parted as though she had one more word to say, and I would not back down, not this time, not ever, and soon enough word of what had happened began to spread beyond the sterile walls of the hospital, picked up first by local reporters hungry for a story, then by national outlets that saw the outrage in the community, and suddenly my tragedy was no longer just mine. It was a headline, a rallying cry, a spark that lit anger across the country as people read about a mother whose disabled daughter was denied treatment by a nurse who chose rules over humanity. And while Linda tried to hide behind the hospital's lawyers, painting herself as a victim of circumstance, the evidence mounted against her, testimonies from staff, who admitted quietly that they had seen my pleas, that they had heard my daughter's cries, that they had watched Linda stand immovable as life slipped away, and with each voice that joined mine, the wall of silence began to crack until finally an investigation was launched, pulling apart every lie, every excuse, exposing how this hospital had turned indifference into policy. And I sat in hearing after hearing, my voice hoarse from repeating the same truth. My daughter was not just a patient, she was a child, a living soul, and she was refused because someone decided she wasn't worth the effort, and though recounting those final moments gutted me anew each time, I spoke them aloud again and again, because if my pain could force accountability, then I would carry it like a banner, and the public agreed. Protests forming outside the hospital, candles lit in Emily's name, voices chanting for justice, until finally the weight of it became undeniable and charges were filed against Linda for criminal negligence. The hospital itself sued for wrongful death, and though no courtroom could ever give me back the sound of Emily's laughter, the feeling of her hand in mine, I sat through every hearing with my head held high, clutching the locket that held her picture, knowing she was with me, that she was the reason I would not stop, and when the verdict came down guilty with sentencing to follow, I felt no joy, only a hollow relief, as though justice was a drop of water on a wildfire of grief, but still it mattered because it meant the world had acknowledged her life, it meant her death had not been dismissed as just another line in a hospital logbook, and when reporters thrust microphones toward me afterward, asking if I felt satisfied, if I felt vindicated, I looked into the cameras with tears streaming freely and said the only truth I knew, that I would never feel whole again, that justice could never replace what was taken, but that I had kept my promise, that Emily's voice had been heard through mine, that her final breath had not been in vain, and I begged the world to remember her, to see her not as a statistic, but as a little girl whose smile could light up a room, whose laughter was brighter than any star, whose life had been cut short not by fate but by cruelty, and though my arms ached with the emptiness of never holding her again, though nights stretched on endlessly with the echo of her absence, I carried on, turning my pain into purpose, speaking at hospitals, schools, anywhere that would listen, demanding reforms, demanding compassion, demanding that no other parent should ever have to cradle their dying child while help stood just feet away and refused to act, and over time, I saw change ripple outward, policies rewritten, training programs launched, compassion placed above cold bureaucracy, and in those moments, though the ache never left, though my heart remained fractured, I felt Emily beside me, her memory alive, in every tear shed, in every voice raised, in every law changed, and I whispered to her in the quiet of my room at night that we had done it, that her story had shaken the world, that she would never, ever be forgotten, because though the nurse had refused to treat her, though she had died in my arms, her legacy had become larger than their neglect, her spirit stronger than their silence. And in that truth, fragile yet unbreakable, I found the only peace left for me, that Emily lived on in the fight for compassion, in the demand for justice, in every child saved because her mother refused to be silent.